Eric groaned, setting his mug down and picking up the device. The screen lit up with an incoming message from his supervisor at the facility. "Lockhart, where are you?" Eric sighed, running a hand through his hair. Of course, they'd noticed his absence. He was supposed to be on site for his morning shift, but he hadn't exactly been in a hurry to clock in after what had happened. Still, ignoring the message wouldn't make things any better. Not feeling great. Took a sick day. The response came almost immediately. "Come in tomorrow. We need to talk." "Great," Eric muttered, tossing the tablet back onto the table. That's not ominous at all. He stood, stretching and trying to shake off the lingering tension. Maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe the facility didn't know what he'd done. They couldn't possibly have security footage of him unlocking that door, could they? And even if they did, what would they do about it? He was just a low-level maintenance tech, hardly the mastermind type. Still, the unease gnawed at him. The facility wasn't exactly forgiving when it came to mistakes, and Eric had a sinking feeling this particular mistake was going to haunt him. He was about to pour himself another cup of coffee when the knock came. It was soft, almost hesitant, but in the silence of his apartment, it sounded like a gunshot. Eric froze, his heart skipping a beat. Nobody ever came to his door. His neighbors kept to themselves, and the only visitors he ever got were delivery drivers who'd already left by the time he opened up. The knock came again, louder this time. "Okay," Eric muttered under his breath, setting the coffee pot down. "No big deal. Probably just someone selling something. Or maybe it's the landlord wanting to yell at me about the water bill." He moved toward the door, his steps slow and cautious. Peering through the peephole, he blinked in confusion. There was no one there. "Seriously?" he said, frowning. He opened the door a crack, glancing out into the hallway. It was empty, the usual hum of the building's fluorescent lights the only sound. But just as he was about to close the door, something caught his eye. Sitting on the doormat was a small object, glowing faintly in the dim light. Eric crouched down, his curiosity outweighing his caution. The object was about the size of a baseball, smooth and spherical, its surface pulsing with a soft, silvery blue light. It looked almost alive. "What the—" he started to say, but his words trailed off as he picked it up. The moment his fingers touched the surface, he felt a strange warmth, as if the sphere were responding to him. It was then that he noticed something else. Small, faint markings etched into the sphere's surface. They weren't in any language he recognized, but there was something oddly familiar about them, as if they were meant to be understood on a level beyond words. Eric stood, turning the sphere over in his hands. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. Had she left this for him? And if so, why? He stepped back into his apartment, closing the door behind him and locking it out of instinct. Setting the sphere on the coffee table, he sat down and stared at it, half expecting it to do something dramatic, like explode or start talking. Instead, it simply glowed, its light pulsing in a rhythm that reminded him of a heartbeat. "Okay," he said, running a hand through his hair. "This is fine. Everything's fine. Just a glowing alien thing sitting on my coffee table. Totally normal." He reached for his tablet, his fingers hovering over the search bar. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. How to identify mysterious alien artifacts wasn't exactly a common topic on the internet, but he figured it was worth a shot. Before he could start typing, the sphere emitted a soft hum, and the light grew brighter. Eric jumped, nearly knocking over his coffee mug. Hello?" he said, as if the sphere might answer. The light shifted, forming patterns that danced across its surface. Eric stared, transfixed, as the patterns began to coalesce into something resembling a hologram. It was her. Her image flickered to life above the sphere, a shimmering, ghostly projection. She looked just as he remembered, graceful, otherworldly, her glowing eyes fixed on him with that same mix of curiosity and intensity. Eric's mouth went dry. "You've got to be kidding me." The projection moved, her lips parting as if she were about to speak. But instead of words, a series of melodic tones filled the room, each one resonating in a way that felt more like emotion than sound. I don't understand, Eric said, feeling absurd for talking to what was essentially a glowing baseball. The tones shifted, growing softer, and for a moment, Eric thought he caught the faintest hint of sadness. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the projection vanished, leaving the sphere glowing softly on the table once more. Eric leaned back, staring at the object in stunned silence. Whatever he'd gotten himself into, it was far from over. And somehow, he had a feeling this was only the beginning. Eric sat with his head in his hands, the faint hum of the glowing sphere filling the room like a distant whisper. He had tried everything he could think of to make sense of the projection, recording it, analyzing the tones with some free audio software on his tablet, even playing it backward to see if it spelled out some kind of hidden message. But nothing had worked. It was just him and the glowing alien artifact now, sitting on his coffee table like an uninvited house guest. "Okay," he said aloud, breaking the silence. "This is fine. I'll just wait for the next cryptic light show and hope it comes with subtitles this time." The sphere offered no reply, its glow pulsing gently as if mocking his frustration. Eric got up, pacing the length of his apartment for the 100th time that day. He'd been careful not to leave, partly because he didn't want to risk running into anyone from the facility, and partly because he had no idea how safe it was to leave the sphere unattended. For all he knew, it could sprout legs and walk away the moment he stepped outside. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Eric froze, his heart lurching into his throat. Another knock followed, louder this time. "Eric, you in there?" He let out a shaky breath. It was Paul, his neighbor from down the hall. Paul wasn't exactly what you'd call subtle. He was a big guy with a booming voice and a habit of showing up unannounced, usually with some kind of half-baked scheme or a six-pack of cheap beer. Under normal circumstances, Eric would have just ignored him, but Paul wasn't the kind of guy to take no for an answer. Yeah, I'm here," Eric called, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. "Just busy with work stuff." "Work? On your day off?" Paul sounded skeptical. "Come on, man, open up, I brought pizza." Eric hesitated, glancing at the sphere. The last thing he needed was Paul barging in and asking a million questions about the glowing object in his living room. "Now's not a good time," he said, trying to sound casual. "Maybe later." There was a pause, and for a moment, Eric thought Paul might actually take the hint. But then came the sound of the doorknob rattling. "Your door's unlocked, man," Paul said, his voice muffled through the door. "I'm coming in." Eric's eyes widened. "No, wait." Too late. The door swung open, and Paul stepped inside, holding a greasy pizza box in one hand and a bottle of soda in the other. He froze when he saw the sphere, his mouth dropping open. "Whoa," he said, his voice filled with awe. "What the hell is that?" Eric sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's complicated." Paul set the pizza and soda down on the counter, his eyes never leaving the sphere. "Dude, is that like alien tech or something? Did you steal it from work? Please tell me you stole it from work." "I didn't steal it," Eric said quickly. "It was left for me by someone." Paul raised an eyebrow. "By someone? Like an alien someone?" Eric hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Paul let out a low whistle, walking over to the coffee table for a closer look. "Man, you've got to be kidding me. This thing's the real deal, isn't it? Like Area 51 level real?" "I don't know," Eric admitted. "I think so. She left it for me as a gift or something. But I have no idea what it does." Paul reached out as if to touch the sphere, but Eric quickly stepped in front of him. "Don't," he said firmly. "I don't know if it's safe." Paul held up his hands in mock surrender. Okay. I won't touch your glowing space ball. But you've got to admit, this is pretty freaking cool. You're like, what, a galactic hero now? Saved an alien damsel in distress and got a reward for it?" "It's not like that," Eric muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't do it to be a hero, I just couldn't let her stay there. She looked so hot?" Paul suggested with a grin. "Vulnerable," Eric said, shooting him a glare. Paul snorted, flopping onto the couch and grabbing a slice of pizza. Whatever you say, man. So what's the plan? You gonna, call NASA or something? Or are you just gonna sit here and hope it doesn't explode? I don't know, Eric admitted, sinking into the chair opposite the couch. I was hoping it might give me some kind of clue, but so far it's just been glowing and humming. Paul took a bite of his pizza, chewing thoughtfully. Maybe it's waiting for something, like a password or a secret handshake. Eric rolled his eyes. Thanks for the helpful input, Paul. Hey, I'm just saying. Maybe it's not doing anything because you're not doing anything. Eric frowned, looking at the sphere. He hadn't really considered that. Was it possible the artifact was waiting for him to interact with it somehow? Cautiously, he leaned forward, placing his hands on either side of the sphere. Its warmth seemed to increase at his touch, and the humming grew louder, more distinct. Dude, Paul said, leaning back as if expecting the sphere to explode. You sure this is a good idea? Nope, Eric said, his voice tight. The light from the sphere intensified, filling the room with a soft, silvery glow. Eric felt a strange sensation, like a gentle pressure against his mind, as if the artifact were trying to communicate with him. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the light dimmed, and the sphere fell silent. Well, Paul said after a long moment. That was anticlimactic. Eric let out a frustrated sigh, leaning back in his chair. Whatever the artifact wanted from him, it clearly wasn't going to just spell it out. I don't get it, he muttered. What am I supposed to do with this thing? Paul shrugged, grabbing another slice of pizza. Maybe you're overthinking it. Or maybe it's just like a really fancy alien paperweight. Eric shot him a look, but before he could reply, the sphere began to hum again. This time, the sound was different, sharper, more urgent. Eric and Paul exchanged a glance, their unease growing as the light from the sphere pulsed rapidly. Is it supposed to do that? Paul asked, his voice rising. I have no idea, Eric said, his heart racing. The light grew brighter and brighter until it filled the room completely. And then, with a sudden burst, the sphere emitted a wave of energy that sent both men sprawling to the floor. When the light faded, Eric opened his eyes to find the sphere hovering in the air, its glow more intense than ever. Paul let out a shaky laugh. Okay, now it's doing something. Eric could only stare, his mind racing as the artifact began to hum with a sound that resonated deep in his chest. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. The room was a mess of overturned furniture and half-eaten pizza, but Eric barely noticed. His eyes were glued to the sphere, which hung mid-air, glowing with an intensity that seemed to press against the walls of his apartment. The hum it emitted wasn't just sound anymore, it was a vibration that he could feel in his bones. What the hell is it doing? Paul asked, his voice an uneasy mix of awe and fear. He was crouched behind the couch, only his head visible as he peered at the floating artifact. I don't know, Eric muttered, shielding his eyes from the bright light. His heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through him like wildfire. This is new. The patterns on the sphere's surface began to shift, glowing lines forming intricate shapes that seemed to dance and flow like water. Eric stepped closer, drawn to the artifact, despite the voice in his head, screaming that this was a terrible idea. Dude, don't touch it, Paul called out, his tone rising in panic. What if it explodes? Or zaps you? Or, I don't know, summons an alien death squad? Eric ignored him, his focus entirely on the sphere. The patterns weren't random. They were deliberate, almost like a language he couldn't quite comprehend. As he watched, a single symbol emerged, glowing brighter than the rest. It looked like a starburst, its edges sharp and precise. Then, without warning, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against Eric's ears like the aftermath of an explosion. The light from the sphere dimmed, and for a moment, he thought it was over. But then the air around him seemed to shift, growing heavy and charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. The sphere emitted a soft chime, and the starburst symbol projected outward, hanging in the air like a hologram. What the? Eric started, but his words were cut off as the projection expanded, enveloping the room in a cascade of light. The apartment dissolved around him, replaced by a vast expanse of stars. He felt as though he were floating in space, the infinite void stretching out in every direction. But it wasn't empty. Shapes moved in the darkness, massive, shimmering structures that seemed to pulse with life. Planets, perhaps, or cities suspended in the cosmos. Eric turned, and there she was. The alien woman stood a few feet away, her silver skin glowing softly against the backdrop of stars. She wasn't a hologram this time. She looked real, solid, her luminous eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his breath catch. Hey, he said, his voice shaky. Long time no see. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice wasn't the melodic tones he'd heard before. It was words, his words. Eric, she said, her pronunciation halting but clear. You helped me. Eric blinked, caught off guard. You can talk? She nodded slowly. Learning. Your language. Not easy. Well, you're doing great, he said, his nervousness bleeding into sarcasm. Top marks for effort. Her lips curved into a faint smile, and for a moment, Eric forgot about the floating sphere, the holograms, and the fact that he was apparently standing in some kind of intergalactic projection. You are kind, she said, her voice soft.